almost every Sunday over the past 5 years, the congregation of this Church of St. Columba will remember seeing a gentleman sitting in the pew over there. He always had a twinkle in his eye and rather a beatific smile on his lips, and he was always tinkering with his earpiece. Later on, he used to arrive in the church in a wheelchair, pushed by his great friend, Joe D'Inferno. He was always devout, deep-thinking, courteous to everyone, and courageous in his old age. And he seldom spoke about himself. He was almost always interested in others, and always asked questions, and heard about other people's lives. And as a result, very few people knew about the extraordinary, remarkable life, eclectic and varied life that this man had lived. He was my brother-in-law, Tom Conway. Now, few of you would have known that he first arrived in Edinburgh in 1937, at the age of 18, to study medicine at the university here. And when he arrived, he joined the University Officer Training Corps, mostly manned by men from the Black Watch, keeping them in order. And so when war broke out in September 1939, most of the members of the OTC were dragooned up by the Black Watch and taken up to the Infantry Training Centre at Perth. And there they did their basic training. But Tom didn't really want to be an infantryman. He wanted to be a cavalryman. And so when he finished his basic training, he got transferred to the famous Fife and Forfar Yeomanry. And it was that unit in 1940 which sent him down south to the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst, to get his commission. Now, my wife and I took Tom and Jan, my sister, to Sandhurst some 60 years after he'd been there. He hadn't ever been there since. And he spent a most amusing time. He remembered everything about it and used to show us where he did all his basic training, ready for war, to become an officer in war. And he even told us that after 6 months there, they all had to march up the steps into the old building, the white old building. The doors were opened. And as they marched in, they were then commissioned into the army. And behind them, clattering up the steps, so he told us, came the adjutant on a white charger, following them as the doors were clanged behind. He was now commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Fife and Forfars. But because Tom was rather clever, he came out nearly top of his intake at Sandhurst, and always the top 10 were allowed to join what was called the British Indian Army. And Tom, no doubt from his Irish youth and his teens, had read a lot about Rudyard Kipling and had been excited by those tales of daring-do of the Northwest frontier. So he decided to transfer into the Indian Army, into the Guides Cavalry. So the war broke out, the Second World War, with Tom in 1941 in Mardan, just south of Peshawar, on the Northwest frontier. It's now called Pakistan. His medical career was now long behind him. Now, Tom was very good at languages, and he very quickly picked up Urdu and picked up Pushtun, which are the languages so he could speak to the soldiers in the Guides Cavalry, because they came from the Punjabis, the Afridis, the Dogras, the Sikhs. He could speak to them all. And this, learning the language, added a little bit more money to his very meagre salary as a subaltern in the Guides Cavalry, the Queen's Victorian own, which had just recently converted from horses to armoured cars. So began a very exciting time in Tom's life. He was only 21, 22 years old, and he went with the armoured cars out to the deserts of Iraq, where they expected the Nazis to come in from the north. And then, when drama occurred in North Africa, they took all their armoured cars and drove them down through Palestine, down to Cairo. And there, the Guides Cavalry, with the 12th Royal Lancers, were the eyes for the new general, General Bernard Montgomery. They were out in the Western Desert with their armoured cars, tracking Rommel's Africa Corps and reporting back over the radio what they had seen. And of course, he was there for the two great battles of El Alamein. As you know, Tom seldom talked about the war and about his military service. He thought no one would be particularly interested. Well, I'd been a soldier for 16 years, so I was possibly an exception. And I used to arrive at Tom's house with the obligatory bottle of Lefroy malt whiskey, which I wouldn't get entered without, and we would sit down and reminisce. And as the bottle got lower and lower, I heard all these adventures of his, of laying ambush for a man called Count Laszlo Almazzi. You remember him from The English Patient, the film. Trying to ambush him in a place called the Gilf Kabir, where the famous Cave of Hands was. He told me about fighting on the northwest frontier, the men who were followers of the Fakir of Ipi. What a name. But Tom remained in the Guides Cavalry after the war was over until 1947. And as you know, that was the time of partition. And Tom said it was one of the saddest moments of his military career to invite all the soldiers to come up to his desk and to make a decision. Would they go to India or would they go to Pakistan? And men who had served together for the last 5 or 6 years nodded and went in their different directions. Of course, Tom now returned back to Edinburgh, and he returned to continue his medical studies. But I was in Abbottabad myself very recently, well, in 1997, it's not all that recently. I was doing a reconnaissance for an expedition on the Afghan border. And as a result, in Abbottabad, I was asked if I would lay a wreath at the memorial there for what's called the Frontier Force. And of course, the Guides Cavalry were part of the Frontier Force. And I was made an honorary PIFA, or a Punjab Irregular Frontier Force, hence the tie. And Tom said, well, look, if you're in that area, look up a few old friends of mine, and gave me their names. And after the ceremony was over of laying the wreath, I went up and found these. They were all ex-major generals now in the Pakistan Army, from the Pakistan Army, still wearing their guides' ties. And they all to a man said, Tom? Oh, of course we remember Tom, and I'd always chuckle. And they'd say, he was a first-class officer. Frightfully decent chap. Absolutely top hurdles. And I thought, my goodness, the 1940s English vernacular hasn't changed much. Then at last, only last year, aged 97, thanks to his friend Hugh Mackay, Tom was invited back himself to lay a wreath at the Sikh War Memorial in Amritsar. And I still have the image of him from photographs and a little bit of film, of him staggering up between two enormous, immaculately dressed and turbaned warriors, Sikhs, who were taking him. And there he was, as proud as Punch, in his blazer, his guide's tie, his medals, and particularly because the band played the regimental march of the Guides. Believe it or not, Bonnie Dundee. So with his military career at an end, he returned to Edinburgh to continue his medical studies, but he couldn't settle down. Really, possibly for the result of war experiences, but it also led him more into contemplation. And finally, he made the decision to join the monks at Nunraw Monastery near Haddington. the first Cistercian silent order in Scotland. He worshipped there at the Santa Maria Abbey, and for the next 19 years, he hardly spoke a word. Some wags say that he tried to make up for it ever since. He left the order as a result of a difficult decision, but he felt it was the failure of the Second Vatican Council in 1965 to incorporate the reforms recommended by Pope John XIII. And he said, I just grew out of it. Well, for the next 2 years, Tom hitchhiked all around the world, filled with curiosity and interest around him. And there was hardly a country, both in Europe, the Middle East, and the Far East, he didn't visit, or didn't know quite a lot about. And so in 1967, he came back to England, to Durham University, to study anthropology, and to do, as a sideline, studies and courses on Russian and Turkish. As they say, he was quite a linguist. And it was there that he met my sister for the first time, but she was doing languages in the same department, studying Chinese. Later, in 1972, he went to Leeds University to study Mongolian, of all things. And whilst he was there, my sister moved to Ireland to take over the job of curator of the Chinese and Japanese collection at the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin. And then in 1974, purely by chance, Tom wanted to see an old friend of his. You may have heard of her, Dervla Murphy, the famous Irish travel writer. And Tom looked in his telephone book and looked for various people he might know where he could stay for a night as he went down to meet Dervla. And one of them happened to be my sister. Well, I suppose you could call it love at second sight. 3 weeks later, they were married. Now, my wife and the 2 children, our 2 girls, first met Tom, the very first time, when we all went on holiday together to Kefalonia in the Greek islands. And he charmed the girls. They loved him. And I don't know of any child that he'd ever pass in the street without him actually having a word with. And they all loved him. In fact, my children had a nickname for him, which I could never understand. He was called Fat Sock. And I can only imagine it was called Fat Sock because he used to bounce around on one foot trying to put a sock on a wet foot after swimming. And so Fat Sock he became. But they loved him, as all children did. I was always amused, but Tom, when we went swimming in the bay, that Tom always wore a hat. I thought, naturally, it was to keep the heat from his head. Not a bit of it, said Jan. He's so polite. He always likes to raise his hat while swimming to all the pretty girls that swim. But when they had their home in Innisbeg and Enniskerry, he spent the summer earning a living teaching English at a language school in Tokyo and trying to improve his Japanese, and also teaching teachers to teach. And on his return, he lectured at the University College in Dublin on comparative religions, which is his great interest. Then in 1980, with a group of Irish friends, Jan and Tom were invited by the Chinese government to visit China. And it was just opening up to the Western world at that time. And after their free trip, 3-week trip to China, Tom and Jan felt very guilty. They ought to do something in return. And Tom had the idea of inviting a young Chinese girl or boy back to stay with them to learn English. And so they went to the Chinese embassy, the very first embassy in Europe that China had in Dublin. And they went to the first secretary, Mr. Lee, and said, could we invite someone to come and stay with us for a year? And he said, well, can you take my daughter? She's very clever, but doesn't have a hope in her career unless she can speak fluent English. And so his daughter apparently had just joined Chinese television. She'd passed out top in the University of Beijing University. and had done extremely well. She was now aged 27, had a baby and a husband, and so she left both to come and stay for a year and a half with Tom and Jan to speak English fluently. She went back, and as a result, I think, of their influence, she became one of 5 directors of Chinese television, responsible for all the technology of China in the television world. And she also, thanks to Mr. Li, Jan and Tom became their adopted parents. Jan and Tom then moved to the borders, as Jan had taken up a position teaching Chinese civilization and art at Edinburgh University. And whilst moving into Red Hall in Eyemouth, Tom involved himself totally in developing the house and garden and in helping in any way the local community. And during the course of 20 years on the borders, he introduced many interests. First, he started the University of the Third Age and represented Scotland and the borders at many conferences around the world. He founded the Allotment Society and somehow persuaded the town council to take part of the golf course and turn it into an allotment, and is still very active today. He started an organization to collect books for children in Africa. And he and his friends also educated the council about using modern waste disposal technology. I must say, Tom was a man of many parts. And finally, one of the things he did was he helped to teach all the immigrants that came to Eyemouth and onto the border in that area. But none of this, I believe, would not have been possible without the love and support of my sister Jan. And I'm so pleased to see in the congregation so many friends from Eyemouth who have come to pay their respects to Tom. Now, from an early age, as one of 8 children in a devout Irish Catholic family, Christianity was at the foremost of his life. He often said, "It's what Christians do that identifies them." And my goodness, Tom was a doer. His breathtaking knowledge on most subjects, particularly on religions and various religions around the world, came from deep study. He always paused after you asked him a question, thought seriously about it, and then gave you an honest and true answer. His courage and compassion for humanity came, I believe, from his deep belief in the example set by Jesus Christ. His generosity came from a deep care for others less fortunate than himself, and his hospitality from his deep love of others. Indeed, so many young people, particularly from the Far East and Middle East, who stayed with Tom and Jan, have been changed by his presence and his influence, as we know from many letters which Jan has received since Tom's death. He was deeply committed to Christianity through Catholicism, and it meant so much to him. He was a good man, a gentleman, whose life we celebrate this evening, and who once met will never be forgotten. He was simply our beloved Tom. We salute him and relish the memory of him, and we'll all miss him tremendously.
thanks. Now, there will be those who might have a lot of time, and I will do that. But most of all, can I thank everyone who is here, for which I mean this congregation, and everyone. But, just Tom, we only were privileged, most of us, although I know there's some here, knew him many years ago. He even took some people to tea, I understand. But it's been a short 5 years that we've been privileged to have Tom with us. He touched our lives. And now, we'll all remember him in our own way. Sunday morning coffee will never be quite the same for me. Some of you from time to time may see me eating 2 cakes. It's not that I'm really eating 2 cakes, I'm eating one from Tom. So, could I ask you to charge your glasses?
Have a glass.
Have a charge, plenty of wine. And those are Tom's, our dear friend, Tom, many residents of finally, thanks to you for all of here the last few years, particularly the challenges you just come to looking after somebody in the planning camp.
Yes.
Thank you for allowing us to celebrate in this. That's wonderful. So in the back, for those of us who are only new, there's much more to know, and I'm sure many here will say something.
I'm going to say a couple of words, and the main thing is to thank Joe, because he just came to me and said, Jan, the congregation want to do this for Tom. And I mean, I was absolutely flabbergasted. I had absolutely nothing to do with it myself, except to be here and enjoy it enormously. So thank you all so much for coming, and I've got to thank the people with good bustling for my
Now, if anyone would like to say something about Tom, share your thoughts, your memories, now's the time.
Yes,
Joe.
Joe.
I was told I would be saying something, so I'll say something because I count myself as the person who reintroduced Tom to Jan all those years ago back in 1970. So I have to tell you a story. About 40 of us took a bus from Dublin to over to Birmingham. Wild and wet and kind of tricky early 1974. And we were demonstrating, I have no idea, it was a good crack. We were demonstrating outside the supermarket, I think it was anti-apartheid or food or something like that. After South African product, it is dimmed into the past. So anyway, Tom comes along as we're all outside with our placards and he says, what are you doing? So we tell him what we're doing. And he says, where are you staying? Sure, I'd stay too, you know? So we were staying in an old church, a disused church, and we were sleeping on sleeping bags, and Tom came and joined us. He would at that time have been sort of well into, I think, his late 40s, early 50s.
Yes, he was 55 over now.
55. So anyway, he said, I know somebody in Ireland, I think. And I said, sure, we're on a bus, nobody comes us. So anyway, he joins us on the bus, back across the Irish Sea, to Dublin, and he goes and he meets Jan, and we keep in contact, and he goes down to Waterford and he goes home, and about 2 months later I'm heading to India, and I can't remember whether I'd already planned it or whether I told him I was thinking of doing it, and he said, of course you must go, you know the way Tom would say, of course you must go, have the experience. So anyway, I head over to, I say goodbye to everybody and tears rolling down my eyes as I got off the boat and I said, I'll never see you again. I'm going to India. I don't know where it is. I head across the the Irish Sea, and by a circuitous route I end up in Norwich with Tom. And I have a rucksack, a big rucksack, and my overriding memory of Tom is, he said, "You're taking too much stuff. Life doesn't need that amount of stuff." So out of the rucksack, out, and I'm left with 2 pairs of underwear, 1 pair of trousers, 1 top, 1 jumper, and my boots, and that's it. So I'm travelling light. Anyway, he says, "Where are you going to next?" And I said, "Well, I thought I might go down to the south of France, to Taizé." I don't know if any of you know Taizé. It's this most amazing ecumenical place in the south of France. And Tom says, "Okay, I think I'll go with you." As he would. I'm not doing anything for the next 10 days. So anyway, we head off. I'll never forget this. We head off and we take a train from somewhere in London. Remember, I've never been further than the north of France at this stage, so I'm not a well-travelled person. So we get onto the train and we go to, we get across to France and we head to Brussels. And the train stops in Brussels and Tom gets off. And the next minute, the train moves. I'm stuck saying, "Oh my God, where are you? So anyway, I say, "Okay, panic not." I get off the train at the next station, and I'm sitting there, the train station's empty, I'm sitting there, sitting on my rucksack and Tom's rucksack. And I'm saying, "Please come, please come." About 10 minutes later, a train runs into the station and Tom gets on. Oh, relief. Anyway, it is Good Friday. He says, "We're going to head out the road and we're going to hitch to Taizé." If anybody knows Taizé, it's way down in the south of France. So we go out and we sit on the side of the road. Nothing is moving. We're talking about 1974. Christianity, Catholicism, Good Friday is very strong in France and all those sort of areas. We're sitting at the side of the road and I say, "How long will we be here? Will we ever get there?" Anything like that. Anyway, truck comes along and we do. We eventually get down a bit, and then we get down another bit, and everything like that, and we arrive in Taizé. And there are 24,000 young people there. Tom is in his element, absolute element. He gets into these discussions with people because we're all put into different groups. We're all put into bunks in kind of unisex, you know, girls, boys, that sort of thing. It didn't happen down in 1974. So he's there and he's absolutely enjoying himself. Anyway, to cut a long story short, we stay there for 7 days and it's the most amazing time. And then he says, "I better go back to London because I really do have to work." And I said, "Fine, I head for India." On the way to India, which took me about 6 weeks, he had given me a student card. This is another story. He gave me a student card belonging to his sister. So that I would get flights. I don't know which of the sisters it was. Anyway, I head for the boat. I'm going through Italy and I'm heading for Rimini and I'm getting a boat over to Greece. And I use the student card and I get dirty tickets and everything like that. The only problem was, as I come home, I realised they're checking the passports against the student card. Oh my God, I was dead. I was in an Italian jail for the next 5 years and I didn't know how to get out of it. So I decided I'm going to have to fess up. And I run back to the ticket station to say, "I used the wrong card. And could I not pay the full money?" Ticket station closed. Oh, what am I going to do? So I run back to the boat and the man says, "Come on." Doesn't look at anything. Tore out the student card in the Aegean Sea, and there it lasted. Anyway, move on. I'm in India about 4 or 5 months later. 3, 4 months later, I get a letter from Tom. I have married Jan. And we're living in Enniskerry. I said, "Oh, fantastic." So eventually, roll on another 6 or 7 months when I come back home to Ireland and we meet up again. And in the course of our conversations, in that wonderful room in Inishio, where Tom was doing gardening and all sorts of things like that, he said, "You've got to start an Ireland India Society." I said, "I have to do what?" He said, "There's loads of people interested in India. We start the Ireland India Society." Which, of course, as the priest and writer was saying, he was a doer and a starter. So the next minute I find myself president. So anyway, I don't want to hog the floor. That's basically my story, but Tom has been wonderful. He's been a presence in my life for 45 years as well, as a person who actually draws the best out of people. And I think that's what I've heard from everybody, that he gets the stories, he draws the best out of you. And when I said I was going to India, he said, "Go for it," you know. So I went for it. Thank you very much.
Tom was our uncle, quite a long while. So my brother and myself, in the 60s, we'd always be waiting for him to come home from some far-flung place in the earth, Ethiopia or Chile or Peru or China or somewhere we knew, never heard of, read in the storybooks. We'd always enthralled with great stories of the people out there and their cultures. And they spoke different languages out there and did all sorts of different things. So he was a real adventurer, and it was absolutely fantastic. We use an adventurer. My kids now, the ones, call him the desert rat. Desert rat. Chasing Rommel around the desert in my bay. But last year, okay, so I was way back to 1916, okay, and his father and his mother arrived from London as newlyweds, having eloped from their parents. We won't go into that too much detail. And my grandfather decided to be an optician. And he rented a little shop in the centre of Norwich in the middle of 1916. And he decided to become an optician. And he sat there and he twiddled his thumbs, and eventually trade built up. And the business is still operating successfully. And last year, of course, was the centenary. And I was tasked with getting Tom down to the centenary. As being the eldest of the family, he had to be there. Tom, please come down. Jan, get him down. Jan, please, will you bring Tom? I don't think he'll get him down. Tom, I will drive up, I'll pick him up, I will drive him out to Norwich, spend the night, and I'll drive him back door to door. Oh no, too far. Don't worry, I will fly up and I'll pick him up, I'll take him to the airport, I'll assist him onto the plane, and we'll fly the 1 hour flight down to Norwich, we'll get him off, we'll take him to a hotel, he won't have to walk anywhere, we'll take him to the evening do for about an hour, and we'll take him home again. Oh no. Can't do that, no, can't do that. So the celebrations took place, the 100-year centenary of the business took place. Where's Tom? Where is Tom? Where was Tom? No. Tom a week before had had an invitation from very senior people of his own regiment in Amritsar. Would you like a first class trip, all expenses paid, as our guest of honour in Amritsar? We'll fly you from Edinburgh to Birmingham, you'll change flights, you'll fly from Birmingham to Dubai, you'll change flights again, you'll change to Norway, you'll change flights to Amritsar. Yeah, they can do that, no problem at all.
When we arrived at the church today, the first thing I heard was, Tom should have married my wife. Now that was the first time I ever heard that. But the first time I met Tom and John was Joe who brought me out because we were going out together. And I suddenly realised this matter was very, very special. And I can see why Jan said that. Joan, unfortunately, lost her father when she was very, very young. And Tom really was that father for her. Because as much as I was jealous of him often, she really did love him very, very much. And Tom loved her as well. were very, very proud. And as I said to somebody already, we went down to Tom and John very regularly. And I couldn't understand how they could argue without fighting. You know, it was unbelievable. These two people could argue and just never raise their voice. You know, they definitely weren't Irish. Lost his Irishness because of her Danishness. So we were very, very proud to know Tom and John in Ireland, and we're glad to be here.
Hello, I met John Conway in December 2003 when I came to the country. And my husband to be in those days, was playing his trumpet called John Pryor. And while my husband was playing the trumpet, Tom Conway interviewed me with a low heart, questions. And at the end he said, "We need you." Oh, yes, we need you. In University of the Third Age. Then I discovered that all the group leaders in IMOS were saying the same words. I need you. That was Tom. Just like I'm a commissioner here, and my children and then my friends' children benefited from Tom's interest in what we were doing, and more importantly, he always had ideas of what we could do. And it's always, they'd come back each week and Tom wants us to collect stamps. And the best was when Clara and Lucas came back and said, Tom wants to send me out on a mission. He wanted her to go out and be a missionary. But one of the funniest things he said to me, and I think it reflected the fact that Tom obviously had said goodbye to many of his male friends over the years, that he with great concern asked me if my husband was still with me. And he wasn't asking me if he'd left, he couldn't take the talking anyway. He was just wondering if I was lucky enough to still have my husband, because Jan obviously was. And he was mightily pleased when I said that he was. But he was a gem, an absolute gem. Here, upstairs, we used to go upstairs, and then when I got too much, we brought all the coffees down here so that he could still continue to come in. And you always had a great chat with him, and you always came back with a snippet of information about him. But most of the time, he'd been asking us questions and trying to get the children involved. And it's great that our own priest has said, that our Archbishop has said, this is a concentration the church really need in our diocese, is to get the children more involved and build those sort of faith walks now. So we will miss him terribly, as Joe said, the coffees will be the same, but we will continue to eat more cake in his
when he discovered that I was a Buddhist, he was really fascinated. And of course that comes from his years in India. He spent many years with Hindus, with Muslims and Buddhists in India. He knew quite a lot already, clearly. He'd really studied and spent time with individuals and explored their cultures. And so he just wanted to know more about what it meant to me. And one thing he knew about, which is something that almost he had such an eclectic interest in things, and something that very few people know about, are people who are called Dalits in India. Some of you nodding heads. It's about 20% of the Indian population, and they are basically still treated as untouchable.
Yes.
And those people mattered to Tom, And so he worked to raise awareness about them, to support them, to make sure that they weren't forgotten, which in a way they partly are in India. And a lot of those people have become Buddhists as a way of moving away from their caste prejudice. So he and I really shared an interest in that. He knew a lot about it, he was able to engage with that. What was more amazing was that there was a particular leader in India called Dr. Ambedkar. And again, I wanted to come across Dr. Ambedkar. He's one of the most significant figures in 20th century Indian history. Stood alongside Gandhi, but virtually nobody's heard of him. But Tom had heard of him and knew quite a lot about him. And again, Dr. Ambedkar led the untouchables out of untouchability to escape that. And he led them out of the Hindu background that captured them. And for those who wanted to, they converted to Buddhism. Well, very few people know about that. Tom really had quite a knowledge about it, quite concerned, quite a care. What struck me was that whilst I've read about this man and I've met people who've met him, Tom came across Dr. Ambedkar. It's quite a outstanding thing as far as I'm concerned. It'd be like saying you've met Nelson Mandela or Martin Luther King. Well, it's really significant freedom fighters from the 20th century really put themselves out. And this is something that I'm actually certain that none of you have ever done and no one else has ever done, and I don't know if I ever will. Tom read the Indian Constitution. He was so fascinated by India that he read the Constitution, so he really knew about the people. And I haven't read it, I've come across it, but he said it's one of the most liberal, one of the most liberating constitutions. And he saw it as a way of something we can all emulate. And of course, this man who he admired, Dr. Ambedkar, was the author, was the writer of the Indian Constitution. So it's just really exciting that he knew about that, and it's just so hard to get someone to talk about his side of it. So I wanted him to tell me. He wouldn't, as always, he wanted to find out about me and about India and about all the other things. So I learned a little bit from him. But just extraordinary how he took this in so easy, such fascination.
And there was this poor lass sitting there. It was the middle of winter. She hadn't got any light clothes on. And I said to her, "Would you like to come and sit with me?" So she came, and I said to her, "What is she here for?" And she said she was going to do a PhD at Edinburgh University. And it was her first week.
Yes,
First day in Edinburgh. Freezing to death, poor kid. And it was November. And so she said, "I want to do about women in Thailand." And I said to her immediately, "Right, you're going to come home with me." Because I knew that Tom's big thing is women's education. And he felt very, very strongly that if you can educate the women, then you've got everybody covered. They're going to teach their children, and the children will become educated. Education is the great thing that's going to change the world. Now, Toy, she got her PhD, took a long time, took 5 years, but never mind, it's here. And she's now the dean of her university. Having big programs in the north of Thailand to educate women and to make sure that they're all literate and that they're going to have a big revolution in northern Thailand.
I follow Tom's footsteps, and I love Tom and Jen as my parents. I come for this service, and I will leave Edinburgh tomorrow morning.
Yeah, she came for the service. She came for the funeral, so that was lovely, wasn't it? So thank you, Tom, for coming up. Thank you.
for 40, almost 45 years. We now share the house together in Edinburgh. And all the things you've heard about, all the complexity of his interests and everything else, I can tell you that his two favorite words were my wife.
Yes.